On a spring afternoon in 2006, an F-350 pickup truck tore through California's Coachella Valley with U.S. Marshals close behind. Helicopters circled overhead as the driver raced along rural roads at dangerous speeds, refusing to stop. The chase finally ended in a field outside Mecca, California, when the truck ran out of gas. After a brief standoff, the man behind the wheel surrendered. At first glance, the charges seemed minor: check fraud, forgery, probation violations. But there was one detail that made the arrest deeply unsettling. The suspect had been working as a paid FBI informant, and every one of those crimes had happened while he'd been under their watch. What no one knew then was that the fraud would be the least serious crime tied to his name, because if the bad checks were all he'd done, nobody would remember Scott Kimball. Instead, what investigators would come to believe, they were dealing with one of the most manipulative and calculating serial killers in modern American history. A man who'd spent years hiding in plain sight, using charm, deception, and his relationship with federal authorities to stay one step ahead. And by the time the truth surfaced, multiple lives had already been destroyed. Join me now as we examine the story of Scott Kimball. You'll hear how he was able to manipulate nearly everyone around him, and even the people closest to him. Let's rewind about 4 years before the dramatic car chase in the California desert, to the office of the FBI Violent Crime Task Force in Denver, Colorado, where a small team of investigators focused on tracking down the city's most dangerous offenders. Well, it was one day in July 2002 when they received a call from a federal prison, an inmate claiming to have information for the FBI. Calls like this weren't unusual. Agents rotated responsibility for handling them. And on that day, it fell on Senior Agent Carl Schlaff. Special Agent Johnny Grusing, who worked just 2 desks away, remembers what made that call different.
It was Carl's turn to be assigned to the prison, and he got a call from one of the lieutenants there that an inmate named Scott Kimball had information that a murder for hire was about to happen.
Special Agent Schlaff went to the prison to meet the man behind the tip, 35-year-old Scott Kimball, an inmate serving time for check fraud and forgery. Scott told Agent Carl about an elaborate murder for hire plot he'd uncovered. According to him, Steve Innes' cellmate was planning to use his girlfriend on the outside to murder 2 federal witnesses. The girlfriend's name was Jennifer Markham, and Scott insisted people were going to die if the FBI ignored him. But before acting on any of it, agents needed to verify whether Scott could be trusted.
When you sign up an informant, you're supposed to do some background checks. And the background check that Carl did was to run his criminal history. You see, it's check fraud forgery. But Scott had told him up front, you don't even have to believe what I tell you. You called the FBI in Alaska. I just saved the life of a federal judge and a prosecutor. And sure enough, Carl called up there, and yeah, he just had. That's why he was transferred down, because Scott was afraid he was going to get killed. The U.S. court system felt he was a very important witness in this trial that was going on in Alaska, and that his cellmate was truly going to kill a judge and prosecutor. So they had flown him from there to Washington, from Washington to Denver. And he had even reported in the state of Washington to the FBI that yet another homicide was happening and that he could stop it. You don't normally get those sorts of background for your informant. So Carl had made those calls, done his homework on that piece, and it appeared by all the sources that Scott was giving truthful information.
In other words, Scott's credibility as a reliable informant already had the government's stamp of approval. Based on that, Agent Carl made a decision. When Scott finished serving his sentence, he would be brought in as an official informant for the FBI. And so, in December 2002, Scott Kimball walked out of prison, a free man, now working for the FBI. After his release from prison, Scott began building a relationship with Steve's girlfriend, Jennifer Markham. According to Scott, Jennifer was a key part of the alleged murder-for-hire plot, along with another associate named Jason Price. Working under his arrangement with the FBI, Scott began secretly recording his conversations with Jennifer throughout late December and into February 2003. But despite months of contact, he was never able to get her to say anything incriminating.
Jennifer, I think she had a difficult childhood. I know that she actually enjoyed both bodybuilding and stripping. And she had friends that she hung out with at Shotgun Willie's, and they talked about Jennifer just being happy, very good at what she did. She was generally a happy, outgoing, confident human being. What made her what I would call high risk is that occupation of working in a strip club, because you have this understanding that people don't ask you about your business and you don't ask them about theirs. She also was servicing a high-end client in New York. He was paying her lots of money, maybe tens of thousands, at least in the thousands of dollars for her to fly out there. So those two things in her lifestyle made it such that when she disappeared, people didn't know she was missing.
Then, in mid-February, Jennifer suddenly went off the radar. Scott told Agent Schlaff she'd flown to New York and claimed that after that, he couldn't reach her. Johnny Grusing recalled how vague Scott's updates became.
Scott was not reporting on Jennifer. He had just said she'd taken a flight to New York. That's what he told Carl, that happened on like February 21st, and that he hadn't heard from her. So then every once in a while, he would bring it back up. Oh yeah, people think Jennifer's in New York or this or that. And he was pretty vague in his reporting.
Weeks passed with no confirmed contact. Then in April 2003, Scott told Agent Schlaff he'd heard rumors Jennifer might be dead. By June, his story became more specific. Now he claimed Jennifer had been strangled by Jason Price, and that her body was buried in a creek in western Colorado. Scott even requested a polygraph to prove he was telling the truth, and he passed. But when Agent Schlaff looked more closely, the timeline told a different story. Jennifer's car had been abandoned at Denver International Airport on February the 18th, and the last phone call she ever made was to Steve Innes in prison the night before. After that, Jennifer Markham simply vanished. As the months went by, Jennifer's father, Bob Markham, began to grow uneasy. He lived in Illinois, and the family didn't talk to Jennifer often. Given her lifestyle, periods of silence weren't unusual. But eventually, the silence had gone far too long to ignore.
Once he found out Scott was an informant, he ran up against the FBI, our rules saying we can't confirm that he's an informant because otherwise he's not an informant, and then we put people at risk.
Through his own research, Bob uncovered something troubling. In the months before Jennifer disappeared, she'd become close to Scott Kimball. Scott had conned her into believing he was a successful businessman who owned coffee shops in Washington state. He then offered Jennifer a job. After accepting the offer, Jennifer packed up her life and prepared to move, storing her furniture at Scott's condo on February 16th. As Bob pieced together her final days, one detail stood out above everything else. Scott Kimball was the last known person to see his daughter alive. But when Bob raised his concerns to Agent Carl, he ran into a wall. Carl had worked closely with Scott for over a year. He'd watched him pass polygraphs. He'd seen him provide information on active investigations. And as far as Agent Carl was concerned, Scott was credible. A nonviolent offender, a check fraud guy, and nothing more. By 2006, Jennifer Markham had been missing for more than 3 years, but her father refused to let the case go.
Bob Markham, Jennifer's dad, had put up a billboard, a huge billboard that says, "Jennifer's missing, please call this number." But he also took an interview in the Westward, which is a magazine here that gets a lot of circulation. And I believe Rob McLeod had read that article in the Westward, and as soon as he saw Scott Kimball, missing person, he calls Bob. Rob calls him and said, "My daughter was lost with Scott. She disappeared 6 months after yours. Her name is Casey." And he said, "Right now, my ex-wife is married to Scott, and he's up in jail in Montana." And this was in November 2006. So both daughters had been missing for over 3 years. And Bob said, "I need to take you with me to the FBI because they don't believe me, but if I take another dad with me, they're going to listen."
Casey McLeod was 19 years old when she vanished in August 2003. Casey had struggled with addiction as a teenager, but had recently turned her life around. Around the same time, her mother Lori had met someone new. She was falling in love with a man she'd met at a casino on Valentine's Day in 2003, and his name was Scott Kimball. He told her he worked with the FBI, and before long, they were living together. Months later, Casey disappeared. Scott promised Lori he'd find her daughter using his connections. Even when Casey's boyfriend told police Scott was the last person to see her after giving her a ride to work, Scott denied it, and Lori stood by him. Eventually, the two married. But when Casey's father Rob learned Jennifer Markham had disappeared around the same time as Casey had, under similar circumstances, he couldn't ignore the connection. And now, neither could the FBI. That's when the case got reassigned to Special Agent Johnny Grusing. By the time Special Agent Grusing took over the case, Scott Kimball was already behind bars. He'd been arrested months earlier after a high-speed chase in California on charges of check fraud and forgery. But as Grusing began reviewing the FBI file, something immediately stood out. The case against Scott hadn't just been handled by the FBI. A detective in Colorado had also been investigating him for a series of fraud-related crimes, and that detective's name was Gary Thatcher. During his investigation, he'd become concerned that Casey and Jennifer had both disappeared after last being seen with Scott Kimball. And then there was something else he uncovered. Scott's own uncle, Terry Kimball, had also gone missing under mysterious circumstances in 2004. And just like the others, Scott was the last known person to see him alive.
He had been made aware in his check fraud case against Scott that Casey had been missing and supposedly lost with Scott, that Scott may be an FBI informant. Gary wanted to confirm that, which is why he called, and possibly his uncle had gone missing as well.
That missing uncle, Terry Kimball, had been living with Scott and Lori in the summer of 2004, a divorced drifter with few close ties. For 2 weeks, he'd been sleeping on the couple's couch, and then one day, he was gone without a word. Scott later told the family Terry had won the lottery and moved to Mexico, and somehow no one ever really questioned his story. For Agent Grusing, this was no longer a series of isolated events. There were just too many people now, all connected to the same man, all disappearing under similar circumstances. And it was in that moment that he realized Scott Kimball just might be a bona fide serial killer. That's when he picked up the phone and called the prison where Scott was being held.
When I called the warden was ready to release him because Scott had convinced the warden that I think drugs were coming in the prison and that Scott needed to be out to, keep this from happening. And after reading the FBI file, I'm like, please don't do that.
Scott Kimball had a pattern. He'd been arrested, charged and convicted multiple times to reduce charges, avoid consequences, or walk away entirely. This time, Grusing wasn't willing to take that risk. And fortunately, his call was enough to keep Scott behind bars. From that moment, Agent Grusing dove headfirst into the case of Scott Kimball, and with every new piece of information he uncovered, the picture that emerged grew even darker. Early in his investigation, Special Agent Grusing sat down with Scott's ex-wife, Larissa Hentz. They'd been married from 1993 to 1997 and had 2 children together. But after just a few years, their marriage collapsed under the weight of Scott's escalating criminal behavior and infidelity. Johnny describes how that relationship came to an end.
Between him cheating on her, and he also started having an affair with a woman in California and then Montana with her. So she's like, I'm done. And to divorce Scott Kimball, and this is what I found out, why the trait of narcissism is so dangerous, is Scott made it his mission to make her life not only difficult, but a living hell.
What Larissa endured after the divorce was far worse.
He ingratiated himself with local law enforcement, then he would come in, abduct her when she's in the shower, put a gun to her head, take her out, sexually assault her. She would call the cops, and then the cops would say, Scott told us you were going to say this, and so you need to take a polygraph because we think you're lying. And Scott's already taken his, and he's telling the truth. So it was, and this was report after report after report. So that's in 1 to 2 minutes, but her life for 2 or 3 years was as close to hell as it could be.
These weren't isolated incidents. On no less than 6 occasions, Scott had abducted and abused his ex-wife in the years following their divorce. And then, in 2001, Scott was caught red-handed after yet another abduction. This time, there was no denying it, and he was arrested and charged with kidnapping. But astonishingly, those charges never went anywhere and were ultimately dropped after Scott became an informant for the FBI in Alaska. As a result, when Agent Carl later ran Scott's background check in 2002, none of these violent crimes appeared anywhere in his record. To make matters even worse, it was later discovered that Scott's entire Alaska case, the one that had earned him his credibility, his transfer, and his freedom, had been an elaborate hoax. As it turned out, investigators would later determine Scott had manipulated another inmate into writing down the names of a judge and prosecutor, and then presented it to the FBI as a murder-for-hire plot. But in reality, Scott hadn't saved a single life. He'd manufactured a crisis, played the hero, and used it to con his way out of prison and into the good graces of the FBI. By this point, Agent Grusing understood exactly who he was dealing with, and he needed a way to keep Scott Kimball behind bars while the missing persons investigation continued, and he found one.
I found out from other people as well that worked with him on his cattle business that he had a holstered gun he would walk around with. And my goal was to find it because he was a felon because of all of his check fraud forgery. And if we could find that gun, that's a federal charge that there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's about a 6-year sentence. You can't plead it down. So I ended up finding that he got in a high-speed chase in California right before he was arrested and sent to Montana. This was early 2006. And somehow he had a gun when he was arrested, but then nobody had a gun. The cops didn't have a gun. The U.S. Marshals didn't have it. So in doing some interviews, I heard that his brother, Brett, was the last one to have it. So I go out to Palm Springs with Gary. We interview Brett. We were able to get Brett to take us to the guns, and we didn't just find a gun, we found a rifle with a scope on it.
For a convicted felon, that changed everything, because it was a charge that couldn't be negotiated away. And more importantly, it ensured Scott Kimball wasn't going anywhere. By then, in the fall of 2007, Agent Grusing uncovered something else. there was another missing woman connected to Scott Kimball.
We didn't learn about Leanne until we went down to Beaumont, Texas to interview Steve Ennis, Jennifer's boyfriend, and we were solely focused on finding if he had truly hired someone, about Jason Price, or was it, we thought it was Kimball that had killed Jennifer, so the focus had nothing to do with any other victims. At the very end of the interview, when the guard was coming, you talk about by the grace of God. It wasn't my interview strength that caused us to learn about Leanne. It was just that the guard took 2 more minutes than he normally did. It's like, hey, Steve, so what else? Outside of Jennifer, what else going on? And he just drops a bomb by saying, oh, yeah, there's another inmate that lost his girlfriend to Kimball. But yeah, his name's Holly, Steve Holly, and I think it starts with an L, Leanne or something.
"24-year-old Leanne Emery was an Idaho native who'd grown up in Colorado, a strong student who graduated high school a year early. Howard, her father, would later describe her as kind, trusting, and vulnerable. At the time, Leanne was dating another inmate, a man named Steve Holly, a man Johnny referred to as Steve 2, and like the others, Scott Kimball had inserted himself into their lives.
Scott was promising Steve 2 he could bust him out of jail, get him down to Mexico, and he could get his girlfriend Leanne down there with some money. All Steve 2 had to do was, before he goes to Mexico, is kill his wife, who's the mom of his 2 children. But then, of course, that's the one where Kimball, as soon as he gets out of prison, tells on Steve 2 and says, he's trying to escape, you better lock him down. So they lock him down so he can't call. So then Leanne disappears. So Scott uses her for 30 days here in Denver to go around and write bad checks. And Leanne had not committed criminal acts in her life before. But Scott had convinced her that she needed to do this so she and Steve Holly could live in Mexico. No one would ever know. Who knows exactly what he said? I had Scott calling her from cell phone records 14 to 17 times a day. He was like a puppeteer using her. And then her car's parked across the Utah border and she's gone. So she actually disappeared then, if you look at timeline, before Jennifer, before Casey, before Terry. But we find out about her much later than we find out about the other 3.
And as the investigators worked to piece together the timeline, a disturbing realization emerged. Leanne Emery had disappeared before Jennifer, before Casey, before Terry, which meant she may have been the first. When Agent Grusing stepped back and looked at the timelines all put together, it was staggering. Scott had been released from prison at the end of December 2002, and within weeks, he'd inserted himself into multiple lives while working for the FBI, secretly recording meetings with Jennifer Markham. He was also using Leanne to pass bad checks all around the state. Then, on January 29th, 2003, Leanne disappeared forever. 2 weeks later, on February 14th, Scott began a relationship with Casey's mother, Lori. And just days after that, on February 18th, Jennifer Markham's car was found abandoned at the Denver International Airport. 3 women, all connected to Scott Kimball, within less than 2 months of his release from prison.
Kimball was the top of the food chain on all the most worst characteristics of human behavior you could imagine. You know, he's a manipulator, he's narcissistic, he's sadistic, psychopath. All 4 of those together. Normally, someone will have one of those 4 tendencies. They'll be a manipulator, but they're not the other 3.
The most staggering thing about Scott was his ability to point the finger elsewhere for so long. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, proving Scott was a serial killer was another matter entirely. With no bodies, no eyewitnesses, no confession, prosecutors focused on what they could prove. In addition to the federal gun charges, they pursued a habitual offender status for check fraud and forgery, charges that could put Scott away for decades. But in true form, Scott started bargaining. Although he denied killing anyone, he did hint he could help locate the missing women in exchange for leniency. For months, negotiations went nowhere until, during one of those meetings, Scott let something slip.
So we're 10 months in is when he said, what if one of these girls is in national forest land? And he's appealing to Dave Connor, the U.S. attorney, to say, maybe you should put me in federal prison because maybe that's a federal deal. The forest thing is what caught my attention.
It was an offhand comment that triggered Agent Grusing's memory, a detail from an earlier interview with Casey's mother, Lori McLeod.
After she talks with us for a while, I believe that she sensed she could trust us. She goes to a closet, pulls out the 2 bags of trash, and sets them on the kitchen table. And said, I've been keeping these bags of trash. This is from the week Casey disappeared. And when Scott said national forest land, now in 2008, I said, I better go look at those receipts again. And I saw one of them, and that was North Park Super's receipt, and it was the day Casey disappeared, but it was in forest land.
Now acting on his own hunch, Agent Grusing picked up the phone and called the Forest Service.
They did find a female hiker right before the snow hit last year. And I said, well, did the sheriff submit DNA or what? She goes, I don't know, you have to call the sheriff. They deal with mountain lions and bears and stuff like that, and it didn't look like there was foul play to them, so they had not submitted the hiker for DNA. And I went and collected the hiker's cranium from Jefferson County, which is west of here, rest of her skeleton up in Fort Collins. I got Lori's DNA and submitted all that to our lab, and they rushed it, and within about 10 days, they called me and said, that's Casey, the hiker that was up there.
For Lori, the discovery confirmed the unthinkable. The man she trusted, married, and relied on to find her daughter was the one who'd murdered her. Finding Casey fundamentally transformed the case against Scott. Now, prosecutors finally had leverage to pursue murder charges. But even then, a conviction was far from guaranteed.
So now we fast forward to our deal, our bargain. We called it the deal with the devil because Scott was smiling like the devil the whole time. We had piled up the check fraud, forgery, and gun charges. It'd be about 48 years. And then if he'll give us Jennifer, Leanne, and Terry, we will then have a deal to push all this behind. And yeah, he was very excited to go out into the desert. As soon as he went back in the judge's chambers, he drew a line between Utah and Colorado. Leanne's here right by the border. Jennifer's right here. She's only 14 miles away. I can get you them in half a day. And Uncle Terry's up here on Vail Pass. He'll be easy. So we thought it wouldn't be much of a lift, except we had tethered ourselves to this con man manipulator who had no intent of showing us where Jennifer and Leanne were.
When the time came to bring him out to the Utah desert to find the bodies, it became clear Scott had no intention of honoring that agreement. He was there to play games.
So when we were in the desert, Jennifer was supposed to be to the left, Leanne to the right. He kept jerking our chain on which canyon Jennifer was going to be in. He kept moving the parameters, and there's endless, what we call horseshoe canyons. Once you get across I-70 and you look north, it is intimidating. It's just canyon, 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 like a maze.
Scott drew maps, marked canyons, identified locations, and still no bodies. Until their third trip out to the desert, when Agent Grusing noticed Scott appeared to be in an especially good mood.
Driving into the canyon, Scott is giddy. He's as giddy as he was the day that we made the deal with the devil. He's smiling, he's energetic. He's like, hey, if we see a waterfall, I think Leanne's going to be there. But we get him out. This is probably canyon number 20, 30 that we've been in at the time. We walk down, we see the waterfall, and then he looks down, sees a bone to the right. He's like, hey, there's a bone. And the sheriffs looked at it, and the sheriffs were our resident experts because they grew up there. They've covered a lot of bodies out here. And they go, that's probably another sheep bone. Scott goes, okay. And he just turns around and starts walking the other way.
But as everyone else started walking away, Agent Grusing paused and took another look at the bone.
I'm supposed to be with Scott the whole time. I'm actually violating protocol by letting him walk the other way because he's my prisoner. I start with that bone, and I start walking directly up this canyon wall, and I didn't know what I was going to find. And that's when I saw the hair clip. And when I saw the hair clip with the hair coming out, I knew it was Leanne, and I couldn't even speak. Working with Leanne's dad, Howard, for so long, after seeing her probably there just by the hair clip, it was too much, and I tried to speak the first time, nothing came out, and then I started yelling for them to come back. That was something I'll never forget.
Forensic analysis soon confirmed they had indeed found Leanne. A large rock slab had covered over 99% of her remains. The hair clip and the one partial bone had been the only visible items. Ballistics later confirmed it had been fired from Scott's gun. The search for Jennifer Markham was not as fortunate, but not for a lack of effort. Agent Grusing and the others returned to the Utah canyons again and again, but none of it led anywhere. And sadly, to this day, Jennifer's body has never been found. Scott did eventually lead Agent Grusing to the location of one more victim's remains.
He did draw us a map to get to Uncle Terry. Uncle Terry was on Vail Pass, discarded like a pile of trash, which was super sad. The only funeral Terry got was us putting him back together as a skeleton and taking him to the coroner's office.
By then, it was clear Scott had not upheld his end of the agreement, and that changed everything.
Because Scott violated the plea agreement, especially we could prove that with Leanne and Jennifer, is the judge sentenced him. He could upward depart, and he departed up to 70 years. So Scott got a 70-year sentence, and then, of course, the federal gun charge is on top of that.
Scott Kimball was sentenced in October 2009. And although the official charges, complicity to 4 second-degree murders, didn't fully reflect the crimes he was believed to have committed, the sentence ensured he would never be released.
At sentencing up in Boulder, the victim's parents got to speak. Leanne's sister got to speak. And she said, when you killed Leanne, you didn't just kill Leanne, you killed the relationship she would have with her future husband. You killed her future children. You killed her future grandchildren. You killed a generation of people. A sad day, but a day to where everybody was at least glad this predator was going to prison and that would not be out again.
Beyond the 4 victims, Scott Kimball's pattern and the speed at which he killed suggested there could be many more. In 2011, Scott requested a meeting with Agent Grusing at the prison. What he claimed next was staggering.
And that's when he confessed to killing 21 people. But his killing period to us then was 1985 to 2006, which is when he was arrested, which would make sense.
To his attorneys, Scott claimed he killed as many as 50 victims, and yet, not a single lead he provided ever resulted in the recovery of a body. So the question remains, was Scott lying? Or was he dangling the truth just out of reach, the way he'd been doing his entire life? Before his retirement in 2021, Agent Grusing spent a total of 15 years working the case of Scott Kimball in one form or another. During this investigation, he saw more death and human depravity than most people encounter in a lifetime. Throughout it all, he had to remain sharp, present, and relentless because the families were counting on him. And over the years, Agent Grusing learned that battling someone like Scott Kimball wasn't just an investigation. It was a test of who he was outside of it. Over the course of this investigation, Agent Grusing formed bonds with the families of Scott's victims that have endured long after the case was closed.
I got very close with Lori, with Rob. I got to be good friends with Larissa as well. And then I formed, I don't want to oversell this, but I'm almost a surrogate father for Cody and Justin. And then with Bob Markham, it's more, I wouldn't say it's close to a friendship, but it's more of a respect for him because I call him Mr. Markham. I don't call him Bob because of basically him knocking on the FBI door for over 2 years and us not listening. I've always just given him the dignity of being Mr. Markham, and whatever he needs, if my phone rings, he calls me even in my retirement.
In 2025, Agent Grusing published his account of the investigation, The Devil I Knew, Unmasking a Serial Killer. In his book, Johnny goes far deeper into the tangled timelines, the prison negotiations, the body searches, and the 15 years of psychological warfare between an FBI agent and a man who killed for opportunity. We'd like to offer our sincere thanks to Agent Johnny Grusing for generously giving his time and agreeing to be interviewed for this case. His willingness to share not just the facts, but the personal toll, the faith, friendships, and persistence that carried him through is what makes this story more than a case file. It's a testament to what happens when people refuse to stop looking for answers, and what it means to ensure that the people who were lost are never forgotten. Before you go, I just wanted to let you know that The Minds of Madness is also a long-running podcast with a back catalog of over 300 episodes, stories you can listen to anytime. So if you ever want to continue these stories when you can't watch, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.